Hello, my name is Anthony Del Castillo, and this is my author discussion on James Weldon Johnson and his novel, An Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, as well as the introduction to the Harlem Renaissance. To begin, I want to offer a little background on James Weldon Johnson and his roles as a civil rights activist in the early 20th century. James Weldon Johnson was born in 1871 in Jacksonville, Florida, where he grew up with his brother John Johnson and his mother Helen Louise, who educated the two boys in their early years with an emphasis on English literature and European music. Johnson attended public school and then the Clark Atlanta University, where he graduated in 1894 with a new sense of purpose to use his education to help advance African American rights. He worked in education as well as a lawyer and a diplomat for President Roosevelt, and eventually settled down with his wife Grace in 1910. At this time, Johnson became extremely active in the Harlem Renaissance by writing poetry, and by the 1920s he was renowned for his works. It was at this time, in the 1920s, that Johnson became the first black executive secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and pushed the association to greatness in combating the civil injustices against African Americans at the time, such as lynching. Johnson eventually died in 1938, but his poetry and novels live on today as a reminder of the effects of slavery, even on those African Americans born naturally free. Arguably the most popular of Johnson's novels is an autobiography of an ex-colored man. Before evaluating the merit of this novel, I'm going to offer a quick summary of it. This story is about a fictional unnamed narrator who is African American by lineage, but white in appearance. The story begins as the narrator talks of his childhood in Georgia, in which he first realizes that he is African American. This happens when the principal of the school comes to class and asks all the white children to stand, and when the narrator does, the principal tells him to sit. This was the first in a line of traumatic incidents for the narrator, including when he finds that his white father is married to a different white woman than his mother, and finally his mother's death before college. Misfortune befalls the narrator, and he is forced to go work in a cigar factory instead of college. But then things start to look up for the narrator as he becomes employed by a millionaire to play music, which is his passion. He travels to Europe only to end up back in the South, where he witnesses a black man being burned alive and decides that he must pass as white. He does so for the rest of the novel, except when he tells the woman he is to marry of his lineage. He eventually marries her and lives the rest of his life as a white man. Evaluating this novel, I first want to talk about how the narrator struggles with his identity. Throughout the novel, the narrator struggles because he likes the idea of being white and having such privilege, but he also likes the black culture he's leaving behind. This is explained when he says, out of a chaos of ignorance and poverty, they have evolved a social life of which they need not be ashamed. Obviously, he yearns to be black, but ultimately chooses to be white out of fear, which shows the lasting effect of discrimination in the United States. Continuing, racial passing is the largest theme in this novel and was a huge part of the era in which it was written. It is said that the classical racial passer in the United States has been the white Negro, the individual whose physical appearance allows him to present himself as white, but whose black lineage, typically only a very partial black lineage, makes him Negro according to dominant racial rules. This is exactly what the narrator exemplifies in the novel, and shows that more people were hurt by discrimination in America than most notions actually point to at the time. Finally, a huge surprising theme in this book to me was the extreme racial tensions of all ages. This is demonstrated when the narrator recalls that on one such afternoon, one of the black boys turned suddenly on his tormentors and hurled a slate. It struck one of the white boys in the mouth, cutting a slight gash in his lips. At sight of blood, the boy who had thrown the slate ran. His companions quickly followed. We ran after them, pelting them with stones until they separated in several directions. I was very much wrought up over the affair, and went home and told my mother how one of the niggers had struck a boy with a slate. The pure hatred in this novel shows how divided the country was due to discrimination at the time. This novel connects to the Harlem Renaissance as this was one of the first works that expressed that the African Americans, even the so-called white ones, had a great passion for the art and music culture. It instilled the African American as being intellectual and not of the racist stereotypes. It showed, just like the Harlem Renaissance, that African Americans belonged in big cities and cultural centers. The Harlem Renaissance itself was part of the New Negro movement, in which African Americans began to reinvent the way they were viewed, and was ultimately a precursor to the Civil Rights Movement. This Renaissance was initiated by a migration of African Americans from the South to the big cities of the North. Most in particular was New York City. This movement increased literacy as well as socio-economic stances for African Americans, developing an explosion of culture and racial pride. The visibility of the successful African American was increased enormously, especially thanks to the nightlife created in Harlem, New York, by such activity. This era lasted throughout the 1920s and 30s, and ultimately was never forgotten, but laid the groundwork for social equality in America. Thank you for watching. Here listed is the references for my presentation. Thanks again.